All right, greetings, friends. Welcome to April 20th. This is going to be lecture one. So this lecture, there's two recorded lectures, a TED Talk, and then an extended interview. I'm going to go ahead and warn you on the front end. We've got some ground to cover this week. We're dealing with the systemic issues surrounding racism and our capacity to be involved and engaged and transformative in those systems. And so I want to do the best I can with due diligence to engage each one of these topics. And I recognize with some additional videos to watch, it may be heavy in terms of content. Now, in terms of a lot of work that you have to do, you're pretty much just reading Southside, so there's not a lot of extra work to do. But I do want to invite you to make sure that you're paying good attention to the lectures because we're covering a lot of ground, and these will factor into the work that we do in setting up the path towards reconciliation that we're going to be investing ourselves in at the beginning of next week. So today I want to start off with a bit of, it's sort of a pseudo-devotional thought, but also a lecture. And I want to share with you out of Luke chapter 4. As Jesus begins his ministry, we see this Isaiah vision and this sort of vision of Jubilee as Jesus speaks it when he sits down in the synagogue and unfurls the scroll to the book of Isaiah. And he reads this portion of it. It's out of Isaiah 61, but it's found in Luke chapter 4. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom from the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free." And then he says these words, "to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So at the launch of Jesus' ministry in the book of Luke, we want to take seriously this Isaiah vision that Jesus leads into his ministry with. Now, to say that we're going to take seriously the Isaiah vision is to recognize that Jesus' beginning is rooted in a prophetic text. And really, Isaiah is rooted in this prophetic criticism. And by prophetic, I don't mean just telling the future or sort of the wonkiness that exists out in the culture today. By prophetic, I mean the call of humanity back into alignment with God and the recognition that the prophetic ministry is one that takes seriously speaking truth to power. There's a great quote here from Walter Brueggemann, who is an Old Testament scholar, and he wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination, and I would really encourage you at some point in your journey to read this book. And he says this: "The task of the prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and a perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us." So the task of prophetic ministry is to call into question the prevailing notions and the assumptions often taken up in the systems around us, and to recognize that the scriptures, that God calls us into an alternative consciousness and invites us to participate in that alternative consciousness around us. And I think reconciliation begins at the point at which we believe in this alternative vision. That the way things aren't to remain the same forever. That the divisions that separate us can be healed, that the systems that bind us can be loosened, that the powers that corrupt us that can be redeemed, that there is a way of being in this world that exists to protect us from our blind participation in binding and dividing forces that often lead to forms of unjust treatment of one another based upon arbitrary distinctions. And if we think about the context of this course, that's really what is at heart at a deep level in this ministry of reconciliation. It's the recognition that there exists assumptions, biases, prejudices, and systems that continue to divide and bind us. And that we are called, as a part of this prophetic task, to call into question the prevailing notions and assumptions of those systems and to offer then an alternative. Now, what I love is that this prophetic ministry is not only rooted in the works of people like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Elijah and Elisha, but this prophetic vision, this vision of alternative consciousness, is rooted in the very life of Israel from the get-go. We see this as it is embedded in the communal life, the corporate life of Israel together. So Israel needs to, and we need to go back to what we talked about last week, is that Israel understands that sin is not just the act of individual choice, but that sin is rooted in communal participation. And so sin is in a sense taken up into the life of the community, and we often create systems and structures that we wed with what Walter Wink calls the principalities and powers of darkness at work in this world, that bind people from their fullness of life. That when sin is taken up into corporate life, it becomes systems and structures that becomes powers and principalities that actually bind people from participation and keep them from living into the fullness. Now, Israel's corporate life was to manage and mitigate against that injustice and unequal treatment. And you see this even way back into the roots of the Torah. You see it in the ways in which they talk about owning servants and when we are to release servants without having them to have to pay for their release. We talk about the fair treatment of scales and balances, recognizing that you can't just because you can. It's not just good business to take advantage of people through the poor use of scales or take advantage of the most vulnerable through the unfair practice of commercial activities. That's not okay. That there is supposed to be an equitable and fair treatment even within commercial business. That we need to understand proportionality in punishment. That if you read through the Torah, there are prescriptions on how we are to handle acts or infractions that do damage to other people, and how Israel's laws were to prevent disproportionality, to ensure that this tit-for-tat game that ultimately leads towards the unjust treatment of other groups of people or escalating violence isn't embedded in the communal life. We talk about this in terms of not gleaning to the edges of your field. When you are harvesting your field, the Bible says you're not to glean to the edges, meaning you're to leave the edges for the poor, and you're not to make a second trip to make sure you get everything off the ground that you can, but those who have not will then be provided for. And so even though this is so counterintuitive to what we have been indoctrinated into in our rabidly capitalistic system that suggests we've got to get the most out of everything that we can, this is embedded in the very corporate life of Israel to ensure that injustice isn't the means by which they operate in their dealings with one another. It's the care for the marginalized and the most vulnerable. There's constant reference to the widows and orphans amongst them. And then there's this practice of Jubilee, which I think is a phenomenal practice. Every 50 years, people are supposed to be released from debt. It's this grand sort of reset button in the history of Israel. So when Jesus begins to speak about the year of the Lord's favor, he has in mind this idea of Jubilee, this reset button against the powers and principalities of injustice that had influenced so many and bound so many from experiencing this flourishing of life. And then that speaks to the prophetic role. The prophetic role is about speaking truth to power. It's about naming unjust systems, and it's about identifying the results of our injustices. Like prophets will say over and over again, for those who live unjustly, wrath will be the result. Not simply because God is eager to punish, but because when we step into injustice, we're stepping into chaos, and chaos carries with it its own consequences. Calling systems and structures back into alignment with what God designed and desired for them to do. Structures and systems aren't inherently evil, they're amoral. It's just when they are perverted and corrupted by human participation, they ought to be called back into alignment with God's ordering of them in this world. And this is not just about Israel's life either. If you read the first few chapters of the book of Amos, Amos is holding accountable all the nations surrounding Israel and Judah for their injustices as well. That God is concerned about the ways in which we mistreat one another, because if we are serious that we bear within us the Imago Dei, then our treatment of one another based upon that Imago Dei must take into account the call to justice. This is the launch of the Lucan ministry of Jesus, this prophetic call into Jubilee, this kingdom reset that is at work in Jesus' life. challenging the assumptions of the structures and systems, the principalities and the powers that are embedded ultimately in what Walter Wink is going to call a domination system. This is the collective powers and principalities of powers that are then brought into this collective system that we might even call an empire, in which it really exercised control of imagination and the social atmosphere collectively for all people in all places. And Jesus wants to disrupt those systems, whether they're the religious systems of the Jews or the political systems of the Romans. But one of the things that we want to keep in mind as we move on to this next lecture, and as we move through identifying the systemic issues of racism, is that we're not only given to prophetic critique, which means calling them into account, but we're also given to a prophetic imagination. That part of the prophetic imagination is the recognition that we have been called to reimagine the possibilities for transformation and redemption, so that there is full participation within these systems and structures, so that people, all people, regardless of the arbitrary distinctions that we try to place upon them, can participate fully in the flourishing of life. So what does it mean? And again, we're going to talk about systematic injustice. And for some of us, that can feel so debilitating. Like, what can I possibly do? We are called to a prophetic imagination in which we imagine the capacity of the church to step in, participate in the healing, redeeming, restoring, and reforming of these systems and structures for the equitable, just treatment of those that by arbitrary distinctions like race are bracketed out. We'll get more into that in the second lecture.